We have an invitation from composer Stanley Grill to listen to his Music for Peace project, some selections from which are featured on his latest album, Against War. And we can learn the story behind it since the composer himself is joining me on the other line. And with that, Stanley, welcome on to Classical Conversations.
Happy to be here. Happy to talk about my album.
Against War, I mean, that's an album title that speaks for itself, but I was hoping you could maybe shed some light on the nuances of your perspective on war and even how that's evolved with time and personal experience.
My sense about war was pretty much formed as a 10-year-old. Um, my mom at the time took us on a little expedition to Gettysburg. And I remember walking across the field of Pickett's Charge as a very imaginative young man and just sort of hearing the screams and the cannon fire and the smoke and thinking to myself, grown-ups are really insane if they will allow themselves to be put into this situation. This world is crazier than I thought. And while I wouldn't call myself 100% a pacifist, because there are some really bad people in the world and you couldn't have peace as long as they're around. And sometimes the only way to get rid of them is through war. Um, Hitler and Nazis being a good example. Um, Yet it's always been my a motivating force for me to imagine a world without war, where human beings, instead of behaving as we've been doing for our entire existence on the planet, actually act with reason and work out our differences peacefully, and that it's possible. Um, so I started my Music for Peace project years ago. It's got dozens of pieces in it. Hasn't worked, uh, but I keep trying. So there are three pieces on the album, but Against War is one of them. And that has a particular history too. Uh, when the U.S. under George Bush Jr. was ready to dive into a war in Iraq and Afghanistan, uh, his wife, Laura Bush, in, scheduled a poetry symposium at the White House. And prior to that, the then poet laureate, Sam Hamill, had an open invitation to poets to write a poem against war. And 11,000 poets responded. Laura Bush canceled the poetry symposium, and later on, Sam Hamill published an anthology with 100 plus some odd poems that he selected out of all those thousands of responses. And I had that sitting in my poetry section in my library, which, by the way, you can sort of, that's where I get my inspiration and meander around through it, randomly pick it. But anyway, I had that anthology sitting in my, um, up here in the attic for years, wanting to do something. And I wound up selecting 7 poems and setting them for orchestra and soprano, and had the opportunity to record them uh, this past year. And that's it, and put it on the album. So, I was thinking of it in a way. I don't know if you're familiar with Britain's War Requiem, one of the great anti-war pieces of all time. But anyway, that was in the back of my mind in writing this piece. It's just a cycle of songs for soprano and orchestra, which I found out of that anthology just to be extraordinarily impactful.
How did you go
Yeah.
about handpicking those poems? Was it imagery that particularly you felt like lent itself to music? I mean, of the thousands of of
Right.
poets that submitted. How did you filter it down?
So I write lots of music, setting poems that I like. And I leaf through poems in a volume looking for a bunch of things, some of which you just mentioned. It has to first not be overly long, because otherwise it just becomes very difficult to set. Uh, so it has to be succinct, have a really distinct, strong image that in my mind evokes music, and the words have to sing. So uh, I just keep leafing through until I go, oh, that looks like it has some legs. Let's see how that works. And often when I write, an image comes first, and then the music just pops out afterwards. I often write really quickly.
How about the Declaration of Peace at the beginning? And that was a purely instrumental introduction, is that
Yes,
right?
yes. So I had an image there too when I figured people declare war. Wars start without people bothering to declare war. That seems to be happening more and more in this century. Um, so I figured, how about the opposite? You know, let's declare peace. But the image I had in my mind is what often brings periods of relative peace to the world is some catastrophic war where it just tires everybody out. The death and destruction is so overwhelming that nations are exhausted and just can't do it again. So I had this image sort of like the day after some horrendous battle when everything's quiet on the battle and people are just walking around and imagining a time different than that. So it has those little timpani rolls in the beginning, those little drum beats at the beginning of the piece, some horn and trumpet calls, uh, and but then a middle section that invites a different kind of future where there's a more harmonious world that follows. And we can see it in our own times. I mean, yes, there have been wars in smattering all around the world, here and there, but since World War II, we had 80 years of relative peace until our own times right now. Um, because after Germany and Imperial Japan were thoroughly vanquished, we wound up with both of those miraculously joining the world community, becoming some of our own, from bitter enemies to great allies, and thoroughly integrated into the world, you know, economy and the world culture. And it's was sort of an amazing, surprising result of years of trauma. So it can happen.
Amidst everything that is going on right now,
Yeah.
what are some reasons that you find in the world to be hopeful?
My own feeling about humankind is that the vast majority of people want nothing more than to be left alone to the peace of their families and their loved ones and to have a roof over their heads and enjoy their life and not have war. That is the vast, vast majority of humankind. And somehow or other, they get roped into it despite that. And I think there's a relatively small minority who profit enormously from war. And those are always agitated for it. And if they succeed, then all the peaceable folks find themselves embroiled in catastrophe. Uh, but I don't think that's what the vast majority of people desire, or, and they have different hopes. Billions of other people from all walks of life and all nationalities, all beliefs, they want to hang out with their families and loved ones and friends and live peaceably.
This music is such good food for thought for that, asking yourself these kinds of questions. And so I'm sure it would have resonate with a lot of people. But tell us about the collaboration with the soprano and the Czech Philharmonic Orchestra. How did that connection form?
So you see me, I'm not a youngster anymore, but for many years of my life, I mostly wrote chamber music because it was really almost impossible to see larger pieces getting done and recorded. Just the expense of it was too daunting. But um, my ambition, despite that, was really to write symphonic music and to become, I had ideas in my head and a vision of myself as a so-called quote unquote symphonist. And so I started writing larger pieces when I semi-retired at the end of 2017 and had more time and less distraction. And then the problem to solve was how do I get these things recorded? So I just did my own research. I looked at who was producing albums of contemporary orchestral music that I liked. I listened to albums. I found ones I liked. I saw which orchestras had performed them. And then I sent them emails reaching out. And the orchestra in the Czech Republic responded quickly. They're primarily a recording orchestra. So I flew to the Czech Republic to do a first short recording, which is also music from my Music for Peace project called Ahimsa. Ahimsa is a facet of Indian philosophy that means do no harm. It is what Gandhi based his um, successful revolt against the British in a peaceful way. And it's also what informed um, Martin Luther King. And that piece was dedicated to people who, for me, most informed my own views about peace. So there's a movement that I called what my grandfather taught me, um, Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, and John Lennon. Those are the four movements. So 20 minutes of it. I went to the Czech Republic, reported that with them as a test, and we're so happy with the result. We've now done 4 albums together. We hope to do another one in 2025. And as long as I hold out, I'll keep doing. And then the soprano, in another little side venture of mine, I love early music. I love the sound of early instruments. They're really unique. They have just wonderful timbres. And a group in Vienna called the Pandolfus Consort had reached out to me asking if I'd be interested in writing new music for their ancient instruments. And their core group includes viola d'amore, Baroque string instruments, Baroque cello, Baroque violins, and also fiori, which I had not written for before. So I taught myself best as I could. I started writing music. Over the past more than a decade now, I've written a lot of music. Been to Vienna many times for performances. And relatively recently, they recorded a full album of music that I've written for them over the years. And the soprano they had on it just was, oh my God, that's the voice I've been searching for. So she and I, that's Lisa Ruff, have been collaborating since. And I invited her to join me in the Czech Republic to record Against War. We also did a prior album to that, in which she is the soprano soloist on what I might call a concerto for soprano and orchestra. a 5 movement piece setting a long, long poem by Raina Maria Rilke. And she did a fabulous job on that. So she and I have become a thing. We're working together on numerous projects.
Let me ask you, how does it feel to know that your message of peace is out there now and being shared and passed on?
Well, of course, I'm thrilled. I want people to hear it. I don't know that everybody reacts, and I imagine they don't, how I react to music. To me, music is a language as clear as speaking whatever language you speak. Music conveys non-musical things, but it's just packed full of emotion. And the way music joins together has a logic of its own that speaks to me as vividly as anybody putting together a paragraph, intelligible thought. And I hope people listen to the music and come away with something in here of what I intended to communicate when I wrote it.
Well, Stanley, thank you so much for your insights today. We really appreciate your time and conversation
Yeah.
on the album Against War.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to chat with you. It's a pleasure.